everybody, this is Perch, and here's an area that I think is a contradiction. What I'm about to say, it will sound like a contradiction. It will sound like a rules for one way, rules for another way. But hear me out, because I think there's a stark difference between these two worlds, and I think the rules should be different for the two different worlds. And I think as part of deciding which world you want to play in, create in, work in, you should understand that there's two different sets of rules. So what I mean by this, I've done some videos talking about nepotism, about hiring, and I think in particular for the big two, for image, even for kind of big companies where you have a company structure and everything else, I think that the comic industry desperately needs to do some controls around hiring. I think this is an area where HR is badly needed, where there needs to be some checks and balances against hiring some of your friends and bringing in people that maybe you work together in a comic shop somewhere, because the networking has gone somewhat out of control into where a lot of it could be taken advantage of very easily, and also it's not to the betterment of the product. I think that comics as a mass market product from, say, Marvel, there is a definite need to appeal to a wider audience. And if you get one person in who then proceeds to bring in all of their friends, it starts to change the primary goal. The primary goal being serving kind of this bigger market. That's what writing for Marvel or drawing for Marvel, whatever it happens to be. That's what it's all about. And I think this is one of those areas where you just got to have to face facts. If you're on Spider-Man, if you're on Captain America, if you're on X-Men, if you're on Batman, if you're on Superman, you do have less creative control than with your own book, with something that's an indie book or something you control. This isn't a hugely controversial statement, but I've seen some people really want to argue that, saying, no, people who are writing Spider-Man should have just as much creative control as, Todd McFarlane doing Spawn. Except there's a massive difference there. Todd McFarlane owns Spawn. He can do what he wants. If he blows it up, if Todd McFarlane decides that Spawn is going to become a wisecracking dog with sunglasses and a skateboard, he can do that. It may destroy his brand. He may get none of his audience, and he may cost himself a lot of money and all bad things. But it's his choice to make. He owns it. It's his baby. Whereas Spider-Man belongs to a lot of different people. It belongs to shareholders. It belongs to Disney. It belongs to movies. It isn't the same. And I think that there's kind of a misunderstanding here where creative people come in and say, I want full creative control over Spider-Man, and you don't. And to be fair, I don't think many of the people would say that out loud. Some may think that, but hopefully nobody would be under that kind of crazy impression. But that's where I think when you talk about working for the big two, there are more limitations, there are more controls. And when it comes to hiring people, there should be better checks and balances where you don't hire, you don't completely hire friends or family members, whatever it happens to be. There needs to be some checks on that. By contrast, now here's where I think the rules are 180 degrees different. If you're doing your own kind of independent book, your own Kickstarter, Indiegogo, you're kind of raising the money to do your own thing through Image, but it's your project, it's your baby. In that case, I think the rules are almost exactly the opposite. In that case, having a very tight, cohesive team, a group of people who do know each other, know they work well together, know that they've got some synergy with each other, know that they can bounce ideas around. Now, that makes a lot of sense. But again, it's you own the book. It's yours. If you blow it up, if your team, if your group, if your friends do a terrible job shepherding this book, for lack of a better word, it's on you. It's your project. But I think it's healthier on the indie level to do projects that way because a lot of indie projects, they don't make tons of money. You're not becoming a billionaire or millionaire even off these comics. It is very much a labor of love. And so you ought to enjoy the journey. You ought to enjoy what you're doing because, it'd be miserable if you're making no money and you're not enjoying what you're doing. You should be able to at least have some self-fulfillment out of this because I do believe that if you're enjoying what you're doing as a creative person, it will show up in the work. Arguably, that's one of the areas where I think indie books, crowdfunded books, other things like that, where I think that's an advantage they have over corporate comics. You can see more of the passion, the love, the energy from the creative team coming out through those pages because there's nothing holding them back. Nothing is sadder to me than an indie book where it feels like they put all the restrictions of kind of Marvel's editorial system on a book that they're trying to push out on Indiegogo or on Kickstarter. Nothing. It just it's you can almost always tell in the book. It always reads sterile and restrained, and it's giving away the most powerful weapon indie comics have, which is they don't have rules. They can break it. They can do whatever they want. Todd McFarlane could have the smart talking dog with sunglasses replace Spawn. He could do it. That's a powerful asset, and you shouldn't give it away. So I do think, in this instance, if you're doing kind of an indie book, if you're doing something on your own, it's very important to index on the team. It's very important to have a group of friends, a group of people who know each other, pulling this together. You're going to get a lot of benefit out of that. And I think you put yourself at a bit of disadvantage if you make that process too sterile or too just artificial. It's again, it's not a hard and fast rule, but again, I think this is an area where there's a very stark difference between corporate comics and indie comics. Corporate comics, again, it's somebody else's property. There's more of a structure there. You're arguably, this is a funny thing. Somebody mentioned to me the other day is that a writer working for Marvel, they often say this person works for Marvel as opposed to this person writes Thor. You might say it as a secondary sentence, but like Donny Cates is a Marvel writer. He's also writing Thor. He's also doing Incredible Hulk here coming up. But he's kind of first identified as a Marvel writer. Brian Michael Bendis right now, DC writer. Jeff Johns, DC writer. You see these names. It's funny how the writer, the creator, gets associated with the company more than the creation. And I think whenever you have that kind of environment, it means that you should be more careful around hiring practices, who's coming in, who's doing what, because you don't want that process to get manipulated. You don't want it to start impacting the sales because you're starting to get this group think or this kind of, you know what I'm talking about, but just this very kind of one-track mind going on. You also don't want the kind of misbehavior and other problems we've seen, particularly in recent years, where people have used status at a company to gatekeep some and let others in, and I think it diminishes the product. It does go back to I want corporate comics, things like Spider-Man, things like Batman. They have to live beyond the creator by the nature of who they are. Batman as a comic will survive long after Scott Snyder and James Tynion have retired from comics. It will continue to be a thing. There will continue to be Batman somewhere, somehow, in some form or fashion. Probably comics, definitely movies, shows. I mean, you want a depressing thought. By the time you're 80, you will have seen the Bruce Wayne origin of the mugger shooting the Wayne parents and the pearls spilling all over the ground, probably in black and white, at least a dozen more times from a dozen different actors. You will see the Uncle Ben moment with Spider-Man at least 10 more times before it's all over. That's how comics have to live. Indie comics, on the other hand, very different story. There's no reason why they have to conduct themselves like that, engage like that, and they have a much different world. So I don't think it's a contradiction. I think it's just two very different styles that have to operate in two very different ways. And I think comics gets healthier if we just acknowledge kind of where the rules are. And like I said at the beginning, if you're coming into comics, I think you ought to kind of weigh the pros and cons. Do people still do that anymore? They make the pros and cons list. Working for Marvel, bigger visibility, built-in audience, arguably higher profile, get to work with some characters you knew as a kid. I mean, those are all big pros. Cons, you're playing with somebody else's toys and you can't break them. I mean, you shouldn't break them. People do break them, but that's generally either. I mean, here, one last thing I'll leave you with. It always kind of cracks me up when people go and they work on a Spider-Man or a Batman. They do something that arguably breaks the character, where they retcon something or they move it in a way that it's not natural. to the origins and root of the character. Um, what cracks me up about that is it never lasts. The new writer comes in and they rapidly try and clear that up, clean it up, fix it as fast as humanly possible. They work very hard to try and erase whatever, quote unquote damage was done. And so the part that kind of makes me chuckle a little bit is like, why do people do that in the first place? If you know that somebody's going to come in and revert your work, if you know that you're doing something that the company is going to try and walk away from and hide as much as possible, why do it? Like it always strikes me as somebody who really wants to write for the indie, wants to be completely unrestrained in what they can do, but for one reason or another, they find them trying to create the indie world within the big two, and it's unnatural. It never ends well, is the thing. Like the customers, the fans don't appreciate it. The company doesn't appreciate it. People walk it back. I mean, we've seen some really bitter creators out there who are angry that Marvel kind of erased some of their crazy retcon ideas for Superman. And it's like, well, what did you expect? Why would you do that with Superman? And especially if you had this great, amazing, kind of novel, out of the box idea, don't apply it to a character where they're going to erase whatever you do. Save that for yourself. It's not shameful. Anyway, my thoughts. Let me know what you think. I think there's a difference between the two worlds, so let me know what you think in the comments below. Like and subscribe as always, and thanks for listening.